Hi there, folks. Welcome to the next Virtual Photo Club photo talk. And today we are getting a wonderful treat from David Gilliver. Apologies if I pronounced that wrong. However, we will be looking at light painting today. I have followed David's work for a number of years. I've always been very impressed with it, long before I was ever properly into photography, if you like, before I got working, certainly before the club started. So thank you very much for joining us tonight, David, and I'm going to hand over to yourself and let you give yourself a quick introduction, do yourself some justice, and carry on from there. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Thank you. Thanks for the kind words. Right, Andy, give me a thumbs up. Just make sure you can you see a folder full of images on your screens?
I can see half a folder. Give me 1 sec. I'll adjust the view size. No, not that one. There.
I'm going to run a slideshow, but I just want to make sure you can see my screen okay.
Yeah, there we go. That's it sorted now.
Lovely. Okay. Thank you very much. Right. Let me just make sure all of the my laptop's behaving itself. Right. Hello, everyone. My name's David Gilliver. Andy Gilliver. Hey, that's all right. It's all right. Listen, I do a lot of little people photography. I'm known for two things: light painting and macro photography. So because of my little people, it's totally forgivable, because any publications that talk about my work call it Gilliver's Travels. So we'll let you off. Terrible. Right. So let's rewind, my goodness, 24, 25 years ago. It's unreal how time flies. I studied at the Glasgow School of Art here in Scotland between 97 and 2001. And during my second year of art school, that's when I developed a passion and a deep interest in macro photography. And when I began photographing toys and figurines, which is what I've become well known for over the years. However, I'm here tonight to talk about light painting, of course. We're going to get onto that pretty sharply. That picture I was just showing you, that became my profile picture for the last couple of years because of COVID. So I've done countless Zooms and presentations over the last two and a half years. And that was the presentation sort of starter image. I think I'm going to stop using that soon because it feels like it's becoming, hopefully, slightly less relevant. This is the image you want to see of me tonight, isn't it? Holding a lightsaber aloft, Jedi style. This was me last night. I thought I'd include this tonight because this was captured only, well, less than 24 hours ago. I was out on a light painting shoot, and again this afternoon in a blackout studio. So quite good timing to catch me to talk about light painting because I've been doing a lot of it this summer. So here's my new profile picture. Right, Glasgow School of Art. This is where I studied. The only art school maybe in the world to have burned down twice. Unbelievable. I'm hoping they're going to get that sorted soon because it's been, well, an absolute disgrace, frankly. What a place, what an absolute jewel of a building. I hope they restore it again. Let's not talk about that. It's very sad and frustrating. Here's my graduation photo outside the Glasgow School of Art. We're not going to hang about on this one in case you actually spot me. But during my 4 years at Glasgow Art School, like I say, that's when I became more than interested, obsessed with macro photography and figurines. I ended up studying the works of a chap called David Leventhal, an American artist. This is one of his images the only one I think that I included in my presentation. I feel like I should pay homage to him because I studied his work closely for a couple of years. And that has led to me becoming one of the early kind of pioneers, I guess you'd call me, in this style of photography. There are a few other well-known artists around the world, globally, that work in a similar fashion. And over the last 4 or 5 years, and especially since lockdown, into the hundreds, the number of people that have turned to this style of photography to, well, alleviate boredom and seek refuge, inspiration. Many macro photographers using figurines now, which is both good and troublesome at times. But a lovely creative outlet. I implore you to try this if you get the chance. It's a fascinating way to work. Quite fiddly, but very rewarding.
Is that actually tweeters you're using to position the people?
Yes, I do this sometimes. This picture here, I don't often photograph myself, full stop. I'm not one of those people. I prefer just to show my work. But Adobe got in touch. Right, it's incredible. This Adobe contacted me a couple of years ago. I've been using Lightroom for, I don't know, over a decade. And Adobe contacted me 2 years ago and said they wanted to use some of my macro work in a it was their annual conference, whatever it's called, Adobe Max. And they found me online and wanted to use some of my pandemic series artworks. And they wanted pictures of me making the work. So that's why you're seeing this picture tonight, because I'm actually in an image. And it's good because it actually kind of shows you a sense of scale, doesn't it? In terms of how I work and the size of the figurines. But yes, tweezers come in very handy for obvious reasons. And here's one of my macro works. We're not going to talk about macro after this point. Here's one of my macro works from just the other month. Short henge, one for the Scots. Right, moving on swiftly. So after art school, this is where things get quite interesting. I'd kind of already worked out by that point that I was becoming, or had become, a macro photographer / artist, and made what on the face of it, what sounds like a very illogical decision. I ended up leaving Scotland completely and moving to live in the Channel Island of Guernsey. I was meant to, my plan was to go and live there for 6 months, get some work experience, save a few pennies, and come back with kind of renewed enthusiasm and launch my art career. But 6 months turned into 14 years, a French wife, and a baby girl. It's funny how life kind of just unfolds sometimes. You can't plan these things. But I returned to Scotland about 7 years ago, dragged my wife, who's from the south of France, further northwards still. And here we remain. I'm just outside Glasgow in a little village called Gartcosh. But this is why it's relevant. So during my time in Guernsey, I did keep my art practice alive because I didn't go there to become an artist. I ended up being sucked into the world of offshore finance. Very dull stuff. We will not talk about that tonight. But I kept my art practice alive in the background. And that's where my journey into light painting began some 15, 16 years ago. And I didn't touch a camera for the first few years that I lived there. I'd left art school, and it was just at the point where everything was transitioning from film photography to digital. And so I kind of watched from afar as that was happening, with trepidation and slight nervousness, wondering when or if I should pick up a camera again and what I should do with it, because it felt like I'd been kind of left behind, because I was kind of trained in the old school fashion in a darkroom for many years, and felt like I'd have to kind of almost start, from scratch in some respects, certainly from a technical standpoint. And that's why it took me a few years to kind of eventually pluck up the courage, I think, to pick up my first digital camera, which I eventually did. And working in finance, in the offices that I did, I was on a daily basis surrounded by artworks on the walls within the office. Okay, so they were just on the regular office walls, in the boardrooms, in the meeting rooms. Everywhere you looked, there were landscape and seascape pictures of Guernsey. Beautiful images, very technically sound. And they were kind of taunting me on a daily basis. These images looking down on me as I worked behind the desk, reminding me that I'd left my photography behind. And I eventually decided to do something about that. And so, like I say, got my first digital camera and decided to use those images as my reference point. Okay, so to find my way back to photography and at least have a technical reference in terms of what was deemed great photography at the time versus what I was able to achieve myself with a digital camera. And so I kind of worked my way up using the digital camera to learn, landscape and seascape photography, which I fell in love with. But something interesting started happening during this time. I think it's because of my art school brain. I'd always been trained to either think differently about what I am presenting and showing, art-wise, or at least tackle a subject matter in a different way to most. Okay, they kind of teach you to think outside the box. That's terrible. I hate that expression, but you get the gist. And so I used these images as both inspiration and a kind of driving force to do something different. Okay, so like I say, they were a reference point, and I started to make work that looked like the images that I was looking at on a daily basis, with the intention of being able to thereafter do something very different with them. Okay, so here are my postcard photographs. Okay, kind of copies, if you like, of the kind of work that other photographers were making around the island at that time, and still do to this day. I began to notice this about myself. I was becoming subconsciously drawn to, the hours around sunset and sunrise, as most photographers are who are into landscape photography. Such a lovely light. But I was very interested by this notion of long exposure photography. So I invested in, a Lee filter system, which I attached in the front of my lens, and got the big stopper, which is an ND 10, 9 or 10, really dark filter that slows time down. Okay, so allows you to take really long exposures even in daylight hours. I started using these filters and playing around, pushing the boundaries of long exposure photography, even when it's quite bright. That became an immediate interest. And that eventually kind of evolved and morphed into an interest in light painting, which we're going to get onto shortly. It's nice for me to show you a few of these images because I very much enjoyed my time in Guernsey. It became my playground, if you like, for becoming a light painter. I started light painting about 15 years ago, and Guernsey's it's a pretty safe place to kick about around during the night time. And there's a lot of coastal areas that are very accessible and make for great kind of testing grounds for light painting. As you can see, I kind of, these images eventually kind of fade into the nighttime. And so light painting was something I began to think about after a year or two of experimenting with landscape and seascape photography. And as I say, I became naturally more interested in heading out around sunset and hanging about during the hours after that, and began to use torchlight to essentially illuminate the scene that I was capturing in order to influence the scene physically, myself, using portable devices such as torches, which is a form of light painting. You don't need to run around with a lightsaber and spin lights around like I'm going to show you later. You can take a more kind of subtle approach to light painting. Quite a beautiful approach is just to illuminate the subject matters from out with the picture frame. And here's me stood within the picture frame, just to give you a kind of visual reference of me standing there in front of the lens, lighting up the subject matter, which happens to be a Martello tower in this image. A lookout post for the invading French back in the day. So here we have quite a long exposure. You can see the clouds and the light pollution kicking up in the background, streaking across the sky. Not a very long exposure. You can tell by the stars that it's maybe something like 30, 45 seconds. Nothing too long, but a long exposure nevertheless. And of course, star trail photography, I'm sure many of you will have seen plenty of that in your time. This is a form of light painting, okay? So finding the North Star, or Polaris, whatever you want to call it, and directing the camera towards the North Star and allowing the camera to run a very long exposure will, in essence, create an image that appears to show the stars spinning around that central point where the North Star is situated. It's a wonderful style of photography, and you can sit there and have a cup of tea in your flask, while the camera is running. You don't need to do a great deal. Mother Nature does the light painting for you. It's a very relaxing approach to light painting. But you can light paint while the camera is also capturing the light painting in the sky, okay, which I've done now and then. We might see an example or two of that in a short while. And of course, you'll all be very familiar, more so than star trail photography, I'm sure, with car light trails captured when it's dark at nighttime or in, dusk kind of time, twilight. Very popular kind of experimental style of photography that many people have dabbled with. There are countless images like this and way better than this online. But the reason I always like to show this image is to kind of get you all thinking, during tonight's presentation about the concept, how light painting works. The shutter is staying open. A moving light source passes through the picture frame, the photographic frame, and freezes into the image. And the reason you can't see the cars in images like this is because they're moving at speed, leaving behind only, the bright elements, being the headlights and the brake lights in the image, or the tail lights. So as a photographer, as a light painter, you are essentially becoming the moving car, if you think of it that way, okay? You are going to be traveling through the image with a portable light source.
I think
here's another.
Car light trails are such a good way to get started and kind of learn the ropes and see how long is too long and how long a streak do you get, the different speed of the cars and so on.
No, exactly, Andy, and that's why I began, faffing around with it a little bit in the early days, because I was trying to. We'll get into this a bit later, but light painting, when you really start spending time with it, becomes all about controlling light. Okay, much like many other styles of photography, portraiture, studio work. But as a light painter, it's up to you to kind of, to have the influence within the scene where you have control over the portable lights to do as you want them. What you want them to do, whether that be spinning an orb or creating a ribbon of light through the image. But car light trails, exactly, a very nice and easy kind of access point in the early days to understand length of exposure, movement, light. So yeah, a great way to get started. This image we're looking at now is, again, a very subtle early example of light painting of mine from maybe 15, 16 years ago, something like that. So that dappled light you can see entering the scene from the right-hand side, That's coming from me kneeling on the sand, just out of frame, and using a small torch and just literally wafting it kind of very low to the ground, directing it towards these tide breakers in the sand, and allowing the light to both influence the sand, because you can see this dappled light entering into the scene, and also illuminating and picking out the detail in the posts, because there was a bit of a sunset going on here. Well, it's probably a little after the sunset, but you get the gist. You can see the sky just starting to fade in the background, very gentle sunset. Had I just run a normal exposure, you'd have just seen two silhouetted posts in the sand, very dark, okay, no detail. So again, using torchlight to help accentuate detail in the features within the landscape, okay? Nice, subtle, easy, practical application of light painting. And then this is when things began to get very interesting for me. I'm just going to take my hoodie off. It's getting very warm after a very cold day, strangely. I'm now getting warm. I found this image on Flickr. I'm sure some of you have heard of the website Flickr. A lot of photographers hang around on there, or certainly used to. Let's call it the Facebook of photographers. Okay, that kind of thing. Lots of photography on there. Pre-Instagram, okay? And I came across this image by a friend of mine in Guernsey. And I kind of stared at it for a while and thought, I'm sure that's a lot. I was trying to figure out, I was certain it was a long exposure, but I just didn't really know what was going on. So I found Simon, my friend, and kind of quizzed him about it and said, what have you done here? Because he wasn't into Photoshop, so I knew he'd kind of manually created this. And I said, is this light painting? And he shook his head, didn't really want to give much away. And I kind of had to keep guessing until they kind of nodded a few more times before I understood that he'd essentially, using a handheld torch, directed the torchlight around each of the pillars to freeze the light in these kind of circular shapes in midair, passing the torch from hand to hand. And I thought, well, that's quite clever. I was quite mesmerized by this image and thought, as any budding young photographer does, I thought, I'm going to go back to the same location and try something similar, because this is a great beach for photography and light painting. So I'd already been there plenty of times, but wanted to head back to this kind of area to try something similar. So I did. I grabbed my little pen torch and my tripod and so on, headed back to Vazon Beach, as it's called, and did something quite similar. So as you can see, there's remnants again of a sunset in the background, an airplane just kind of dotting its way through the sky as well, which you'll pick up now and then when running long exposures. This is my first, I would call this my first, kind of true light painting, okay, where in terms of me walking into the scene and manipulating light to become almost sculptural, okay? So this is where that journey began. And I thought I'd completely mucked this up, because this was maybe about a 4-minute long exposure, and I'd miscalculated. The exposure should be about 8 minutes long, because this was all very new to me, and I thought I kind of figured out it should be about 8 minutes. And after about 4 minutes, 3.5, 4 minutes, the heavens opened. It started to pour with rain, believe it or not, even although it looked pleasant in the background. It was a grey sky above. And I remember grabbing my camera and my tripod and stuffing it under my jacket and running back to the car, cursing the night, thinking, what an utter disaster. But then when I got back to my car, this image flashed up in the back of my screen, and I thought, you know what, I've got something that's interesting. It wasn't a complete failure. And I actually really like this image, funny enough, probably because it's kind of dear to me in the sense that it's my first true light painting in this style, but also because it very nearly went completely wrong. And had it gone completely wrong, I'm not sure how many more times I would have attempted something similar. So I'm glad it worked out. This is where my journey into light painting really began, where I began to become truly fascinated and obsessed with this magical process. So what I did was I walked into the shot, stood behind each of the pillars, these posts, and like I just described a moment ago, what Simon had done, I moved the torch from hand to hand, from behind, encapsulating each of the tide breakers in light and directing my little torch downwards as I did so. That's why you can see the light spill on the foreground. And if you actually brighten this image, if you were to go into post-editing in Lightroom or something and start to brighten this image, you will start to see silhouettes of me next to each of these structures. You can actually see me in the image. This is the natural exposure that we're looking at right now. You can just maybe pick out very gentle silhouettes, dark silhouettes next to the left of each of these pillars, very, very slightly. That's my body, okay? I wasn't quite hidden by them. You live and learn. But that's what I was attempting to achieve in this shot. And that's how I achieved it. a happy mistake. I make lots of those, and anyone that gets into light painting will discover this. And many photographers live by this motto. Don't be scared of making mistakes, because especially with light painting, it's an incredibly experimental form of photography. It's a very exciting form of photography, and you will get things wrong all the time. And sometimes that can work in your favor. Okay, the trick is to repeat it. Right. Here's something completely different. Okay, this is still light painting, but it's called camera painting, and it's something you might want to try out. So this is where you're holding the camera by hand, not on a tripod this time, so handheld, and directing the camera towards a light source like street lights or a full moon, something like that. And you literally physically move the camera around during the long exposure, and the lights that you're directing it towards paint into the center of the camera and create a camera painting. Okay, pretty messy stuff, isn't it? It's quite abstract. You can create some very cool images doing this. Actually, I've not spent much time doing it, I'll be honest, but it's yeah, it can yield some very interesting results.
I have given that a try. I think, like you say, with the street lights, just try to do circles, almost like a spiraling, small circle, bigger circle, and kind of one like that. And I found out I have no motor skills to do a circle with a camera in my hand. Like you say, yes, happy accidents.
Yeah, I think that's maybe why I did one or two of these and then moved on to something a little bit more controlled and predictable. But it's fun to play with, and it's nice to do it with it. Like I say, the full moon. I've done that plenty of times. Just aim the camera at a full moon, and as smoothly as you can, kind of move the camera around, in kind of curly shapes, and you'll create what are called moon paintings. Something quite wonderful about that. Cool. Okay, so back to light painting, physical light painting. Here's my wife, Mel, the guinea pig, standing still for me and drawing her name out with a sparkler, because we've all done that, haven't we? We've all stood there on Guy Fawkes night and either drawn our name out or done spirals. We all have. I know we have. And that's why, in the book that I've written and every presentation I give, I always show this image, because it's a nice literal way of showing people how the light behaves as you physically control it during a long exposure. Okay, so if you imagine Mel moving the sparkler around and misspelling her name or tripping at the end or falling over, the light would literally follow that movement. Okay, so it's all about control and getting the light to do what you want it to. A nice literal example of light painting, this one, because it's something we can all relate to, and it kind of does what it says in the tin. Right, that's the first folder. We've got a good few of these to get through tonight. So that's a nice gentle introduction for everybody, I hope. We're going to look through a tutorial next, so I can kind of walk you all through a visual, but a physical tutorial on how the process works. Okay, so if you all kind of, don't close your eyes, you won't see the presentation, but if you kind of imagine you're with me on this photo shoot, I'll talk you through what's going on, okay, and how it unfolds from start to finish. So bulb mode, okay, if you're unaware of what bulb mode is, because some people might be, bulb mode allows your camera to surpass the boundary of 30-second long exposures. Okay, if you leave your camera on manual mode and try to run a long exposure, most cameras tend to max out at the 30-second mark. Okay, bulb mode allows you, using a cable release normally, to run very long exposures. Okay, that you can tell the camera to start and stop using a cable release. So bulb mode is important because we're talking minutes rather than seconds in terms of long exposures here. Sometimes you can buy a digital cable release or a digital remote like this one that works from distance. I have used these in the past. I quite liked them for a while, actually, because I could go out on my own at night time and from afar tell the camera to start and stop the exposure. The annoying thing can be, though, when you're making maybe a 3 or 4 minute long exposure with light painting in it, you think you've started the exposure, you begin the light painting, you think you're stopping it, but you're actually starting it, and then, this has happened a few times. And they've broken on me a couple of times as well. So long story short, I actually much prefer these days to use, the kind of cheapo cable releases that plug into the side, the little switch cable releases. They are robust. They do not break, I've noticed. Cheap and cheerful, I would recommend them.
I'm just going to throw in as well, David, if you don't have a bulb setting on the dial, certainly at least with my Nikon that I have as well, in manual, if you carry on past the 30 seconds point, it goes to bulb.
Very good point.
Just in case anyone's looking at a dial and can't see a B.
Yeah, I mean, I teach regular workshops, and it's becoming more and more commonplace now when I teach, 4 or 5 or upwards people at a time. You've got someone using a Nikon, so a couple of people using a Canon. there'll be a Sony. I mean, there's such a vast array of cameras now. It's worthwhile pointing that out. You might not have a B on the dial, but you'll certainly have bulb mode somewhere in the camera settings. So yeah, work out how to find it. YouTube. Right. So here we are on location, okay? We've got a tripod, we've got a camera, we've got a cable release. Those 3 essentials that we cannot forget for each light painting shoot. And we're out at Loch Lomond. I'm sure you recognise that tree if you live in Scotland, out at Millerrocky or Millerrocky Bay. I've heard it pronounced several different ways, so there's a couple for you. The lone tree, just past Balmaha. Beautiful location, great for night photography, great for photography, full stop. So I sometimes teach workshops out here. Here I am on my own shooting. This was a tutorial for a digital photography magazine, I think it was called. And they wanted to see stage by stage my thinking in terms of process for a light painting shoot, which has become really handy for these presentations. So here we are, using live view on the back of my camera to help kind of compose the scene, make sure I've not got a wonky horizon, etc., etc. I like to turn up on location, depending on where I'm going, a little bit before, darkness falls. So I'll turn up in the moments after sunset as the light's beginning to fade. It's nice to just familiarize yourself with your surroundings before it gets properly dark. It can be very beneficial. Safe thing to do, actually. So I do recommend doing that. I then use a relatively powerful torch. Now, if you just kind of imagine this scene's a little bit darker than it actually appears, because it was darker than it looks in this image. I've kind of brightened it to allow you guys to see what's going on. So I'm illuminating my subject matter with my torch to allow my camera to focus, okay? Because I'm wanting to set the focal point on the subject matter, which is this tree. If it's really dark and you're trying to set the focal point, you'll need a torch because the camera just will not be able to focus in the dark for obvious reasons. So my advice would be to keep your lens, your camera on autofocus mode, illuminate your subject matter, get your camera to latch onto it, focus on that subject matter, and then switch back to manual focus, okay? And by doing so, your focal point is now locked, okay? Unless you knock the lens and knock it off somehow, your focal point is now set on that area within the photograph, that plane, all right? It's not going to change. So that's a nice practical way of doing that, because in the early days of light painting, I approached setting the focal point in several kind of peculiar different ways that didn't make much sense. They weren't practical. I used to walk into the scene, place something that was illuminated in the scene and hope that it was bright enough for the camera to pick it up to focus on it, that kind of thing. No need to do that. Get a decent torch and stand behind your camera, illuminate the subject matter and do as I just described. Back to manual focus, you're now locked in. Then it's all down to kind of, figuring out the exposure length, of course, but picking a light painting tool. We're going to look at light painting tools next, but after this tutorial. But for now, for the purposes of this example, I'm using this tool here, which is called, this is really annoying. You can't get a hold of this tool anymore. They stopped manufacturing this some 10 plus years ago. It's essentially an acrylic rod, okay, that's illuminated from below. It's a bit like a lightsaber. Here it is here, okay, stood against the tree. It's like a lightsaber. It changes color. It's a lovely tool to use. I wish they still made them because I would recommend everybody to get a hold of one. But when they stopped making these tools, every light painter and their mum online went out and bought one because they realized that they would soon be difficult to get a hold of, and that's exactly what happened. So the remaining stock was all bought up by light painters, I believe, in the end. And yeah, you'll find these on eBay every so often. They're like gold dust. It's called an LED Lenser V24. Nice long name for you. So here I am holding the Lenser tool next to the tree and just very quickly running a test shot. Okay, I'm just gently moving the light painting tool up and down, 1-2 second long exposure, just to make sure my equipment, my gear is all behaving as it should. Okay, that's all I'm doing here. And it's a nice illustrative shot of, an early light painting beginning to form. We're going to do a lot more than that shortly. Now, here's one of the most fundamental lessons I want everyone to take away from tonight, because this is something that so many people out there get wrong. And it's a real shame, actually, because light painting, I understand how exciting a process it is. Truly, I do. That's why I've been doing this incessantly for 15 years. But what happens in the early days for many people going light painting is they become so interested and fascinated and excited by the light painting element of the shoot. They run around with their lights and make this really cool light painting and forget to run an exposure length long enough to compensate for the landscape in which they're working. Okay, so I don't even begin light painting. The first thing I do is I run a long exposure. I work out what the exposure length needs to be with regard to the landscape, okay? So I'll run a couple of minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minute long exposure until I'm happy that the scene has been captured appropriately in terms of the little bit of ambient light that's around at nighttime. I tend to work between a half moon and a full moon because I like a little bit of moonlight to help me along the way, or help the landscape along the way throughout the exposure. Otherwise, if you're shooting, for example, under a new moon when it's pitch black, you could run a 10, 20 minute long exposure. It's still going to look pitch black. Okay, so the moon is your friend as a light painter. So here we have a 4 or 5 minute long exposure. I've now worked out what I'm happy with in terms of the length of the exposure in which I'm going to be working within. Okay, because the light painting element isn't going to be 5 minutes long. The exposure will be, but I might only be light painting for a minute or two. And the idea behind this light painting shoot was using that kind of lightsaber tool. I wanted to create ribbons of light running along the foreground of this image, which is exactly what I did. So I made passes in front of the camera from left to right and right to left and back again several times over, just in a kind of wave-like fashion, holding this lightsaber and creating kind of waves with it to kind of coat the ground in neon ribbons. Okay, let's call them that. So there's the before, there's the after. Okay, that's me walking backwards and forwards quite simply. And I'm not going to overcomplicate tonight because light painting is not complicated once you kind of get your head around it. This is just me walking left, right, and directing the light painting tool towards the camera. Obviously, I'm facing the camera, okay? So the light painting tool is visible at all times. I'm just gently moving it up and down and up and down. Now, the speed at which you move the light painting tool will have a profound impact and effect on how the light painting is captured, okay? If you move too quickly, the light painting tool will be fainter. If you move too slowly, it will overexpose, depending on how bright it is. So working out how to move the light painting tool is important as well, which will come to you over time, okay? Like any other style of photography, bit of practice and familiarity will get you a long way, okay? It's all about repetition. But I think I captured this shot on my second take, I think. I did this 3 or 4 times and this was my favorite one. So walked backwards and forward. And what I did, and another useful thing for you to maybe hear from me as well, because some people do wonder when it's dark, how on earth do you know where your kind of boundaries are? I'll sometimes find a white pebble or a white rock, something like that, something I'll still be able to see when it's dark. And I'll place it at the edges of the shot, okay? The edges of the picture frame that I'm capturing, just out of shot. So I know once I've got to that point, I can turn back. You see what I mean? It saves you walking way out the side of the frame for way too long and then coming back again and not really having a reference of where is being captured. So I tend to mark the ground in a subtle way as well. That can be very helpful.
Or vice versa and stopping a bit short.
Yeah,
which
exactly.
I've done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's again familiarity, and this will come with time. But when light painting is fascinating in that the area that you're capturing, okay, the 3-dimensional area that you're capturing, the landscape, is your 3-dimensional canvas. Okay, it's the area in which you can paint. It's a beautiful process, and your spatial awareness will get better the longer you stick at this. Okay, so you might start by just feeling quite disorientated and confused by, how it all operates and works, and how on earth am I going to get used to this? It will just start to happen. I've been light painting a lot this summer, so I feel like I'm back in this really kind of familiar territory of being able to look out the window and kind of gauge almost what my setting should be. But back in Guernsey, when I was light painting every second night for years, I got to a point where I could literally look out my window or look up at the night sky and be like, F5, ISO 100, 2 minutes, 2-minute exposure. You'll get a feel for what the exposure length should be. And you'll also get a feel for what light painting tools need to be moved at what speed and at what brightness level. Okay, it will all start to just make sense over time. It took me probably 2 years before I stopped making a real mess and becoming a bit more controlled and logical with my approach to my light painting shoots. And I'll mention this at the end as well, Andy. I'm not an actual salesperson. I don't like mentioning this, but only because it's helpful to those perhaps listening. 2 years ago during lockdown, both my macro photography and my light painting, I wrote quite extensive books about each of the processes. I just kind of emptied my brain into 2 books that I wrote because I was getting so many inquiries because I couldn't teach my workshops for a while. I thought I'm just going to get them all into one place, put them on my website for people to buy. They're not overly expensive. And there's a discount code, which I'll show you at the end as well. I give that out to camera clubs and so on that are kind enough to have me along to speak. But the reason I wrote those books isn't just to kind of cash in a little bit on my knowledge, which is handy, by the way, but that's not why I wrote them. It's because the most frustrating element to this style of photography is making too many mistakes early on and losing an interest in it, okay? Because it's very experimental. The book is supposed to kind of cut out the pain of my first 2 years for those starting out so that they can start at a level, if you like, with an understanding way more advanced than I had when I started out, because it's such a beautiful, magical, therapeutic process for all to enjoy. I hate hearing people that have said, I tried it once, oh, it was a disaster, you know.
Yeah.
It can be. It was for me as well. I got kind of lucky in the early days, but to hear people off put for that reason is really sad, because it's I genuinely believe it's probably one of the most creative forms of photography, if not the most creative form of photography out there, because the photographer has such a profound impact on the end result. So yeah, I hope whoever's listening tonight does give this a go, because it is a lovely, lovely process. Okay, so the histogram, I sometimes, not so much these days, I sometimes reference the histogram in my camera. It's worth mentioning it, because if you don't know where the histogram lives in your camera, find it. It'll tell you if the darks are too dark and if the highlights are too bright. It can be useful to reference in terms of knowing if you've overexposed or underexposed, or need to add a bit more light to the shadows, that kind of thing, which you can do using a torch, that kind of thing. So it can be very useful. And the weather and moon phases have become, something that I always reference and look at before I go out in any photography shoots outdoors, especially at nighttime, of course. I was chatting to Andy just before we got started tonight about the atrocious weather we've been having today. I knew that was coming, so I went out last night on a light painting shoot instead of tonight, because I knew I could get away with it last night, and it was actually a very calm and lovely evening, unlike how the day turned out. So familiarize yourself with a nice, predictable and reliable weather forecast website. Something that can maybe tell you what the moon's doing as well, etc. They're just really good things to kind of keep an eye on if you're going to really get into night photography and light painting.
Do you have a site you use yourself, David, one you can recommend?
Yeah, this one here, what's it called now? Just go into Google and type in UK moon phases or moon phases UK or something like that. The first one that pops up, I think, is the one I always I do that when I'm out. I'll go into Google if I've lost track of what the moon's doing and find it that way. But the weather one, I can tell you more specifically, the one I use is called Windfinder, windfinder.com, I think it is. It tells you the wind, it's just really accurate. It rarely lets me down. It's good for wind speed, wind direction, precipitation, all the usuals. But the surfers use it, that's why it's called Windfinder. The surfers like to use it, and it's just, I've found it to be very reliable. The book covers all these things as well, but that's the website, that's the one I like to use. I was on that last night, of course, grinning to myself because I could see there was no wind and it looked very peaceful and pleasant outside, unlike today's storm. Right, that's the tutorial in a nutshell. We're going to look at light painting tools and the work that you can make using them next. Do you have any further questions before we rattle through this folder? Because this folder contains a few more images, so we'll take a little bit longer to get through. So fire me any questions that you can think of now before we get stuck into this one.
Nothing for myself just now. I think I've just been asking as I go. I think maybe one point that's probably worth pointing out as well is, I learned this the hard way, when you're using a torch for light painting, is not point it straight at the camera, because obviously it overexposes and it creates kind of light flare and stuff like that as well. So it's got to be at an angle that the camera can pick up the light, but not directed straight into the lens. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say, and I would recommend if you're illuminating, I try not to do too much of this. I know I mentioned a few early references of doing that from out with the picture frame, which I do like to do now and then. I normally do it from the side, okay? So I'll stand to the side of the subject matter and give it some side lighting using the torch. I'll normally keep the torchlight quite low to the ground as well. Just makes it a little bit more subtle and dramatic. Yeah, that sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? But it does work that way. So yeah, subtle drama. But yeah, I don't aim the torchlight directly, either from behind the camera straight down or straight at the camera. I have used a torch. I have directed torchlight directly towards the camera lens before from within the picture frame, but to create starbursts, just by switching the torch on and off quickly. Yeah. A slightly higher aperture, that can be quite a nice effect, actually. That is one time you might want to try it. But yeah, for lighting, exactly as you mentioned.
Cool, thank you.
Right. You all good, Nick? You're the only two I can see, right? Okay, here are the light painting tools, or some of them. This collection has doubled, if not trebled, in the last couple of years. It's becoming a little bit problematic for me. I am an addict. But it's because there are light painters out there now. It's a really interesting time to become involved with light painting, because if we rewind maybe 6-7 years ago, there was maybe 1-2 light painting tools online that were specifically designed for light painting, okay, by light painters. There weren't many. But because light painters become, or is becoming, this movement, this wave, that's followed, that's rippled through the kind of photography community, it's becoming more and more popular. It's still very niche, but it's becoming more popular. And a bit like myself, there are many other professional light painters around the world out there who craft and sell their own light painting tools. And some of the ones that we're looking at here have been sourced from them. Some of them are just random objects that are portable and illuminate, like finger LEDs, keychains, glow sticks, okay? Because if we go back 10 years ago, or not even, there was no such thing as a light painting tool. It was just whatever you could find to light paint with, okay? So torches, mobile phones, Christmas tree lights, sparklers. But it's a really exciting chapter right now to be involved with light painting, because there are more and more light painters crafting exceptional tools to go light painting with. We'll look at a few of those this evening. Here's a gratuitous kit shot of some of the gear that I use. Like I say, a lot more has arrived this year from America, from a new company that's now creating a very cool light painting torch. Right, camera gear. I'm not going to rattle on about camera gear for too long, because each to their own. That is my mantra. I'm still using a Canon 5D Mark III. Have been for a long time now. Soon to be maybe modified or upgraded. We'll see. But it's the lens that I like to point out in this shots that should be of interest. I like to use my 24mm prime lens. Okay, I've been using that for years. It's an excellent landscape lens and lends itself incredibly well to night photography and light painting. It can be opened up super wide, I think 1.2 or something like that, 1.4, 1.2. I don't ever open it up that wide, but you can. It's just a very sharp, great quality lens. It's quite pricey when you get into all the L series stuff, but I've worked my way up over many years to own that lens. But that's the lens I personally use on most of my light painting shoots, sometimes my 16mm lens as well. Torches, these will become your best friend if you want to get into night photography and light painting, because they'll stop you falling flat in your face in the dark, and they'll also make for useful tools to light paint with at times as well. Here's a few of them. I own many torches, different shapes, sizes, and strengths. But the one that I used in the tutorial to illuminate the tree, if you remember, that was the one on the right-hand side. It's quite a punchy torch, that one. It's called the X7R LED lenser. This is a make of torch that many light painters use, because they make quite a broad range of torches, and they've become quite renowned because they emit a color of light very similar to that of daylight. Okay, there's a slight kind of bluish hue to it, so quite a neutral color. There's no nasty color cast. Okay, which is why these torches have become liked by light painters. There are many more in the market now. L wire. Okay, electroluminescent wire. Now, don't panic if you're trying to store everything I'm saying tonight. All these tools and many more are contained in that book I was talking about earlier, if you want to go and look at that later. This stuff's called electroluminescent wire. It's quite fun to play around with. You can get this on eBay or Amazon for relatively cheap. I think a pack of 8 of them costs only about 20 quid or something. And here we are during one of my light painting workshops. We had 8 people in this workshop, and 4 of them stood behind the 4 people we're looking at here. They stood like statues in a fixed pose, and the other 4 went in behind them, jiggling around the L wire. And that's the kind of effect that it created. Okay, probably a 30-second long exposure, something like that. Punchy stuff. And here we have a school hall somewhere on the west coast of Scotland. I can't remember which school this one was exactly. It might have been Paisley. Anyway, 10 very energetic school children, secondary school pupils, running around a gym hall, each armed with a piece of L wire. And that's what happened. That's what it looks like during a long exposure. Color and energy. And of course, like I always try to do, take the light painting tools outdoors, to experiment with them within the landscape itself. The bathing pools on Guernsey, this outdoor area we're looking at right now, this became my kind of testing ground. This was just down the hill from where I lived, where my flat was. And I used to kind of roll down that hill whenever I got a new light painting tool and just set up shop and and play around for a couple of hours to see what the tool was capable of doing, of creating. So there's a few images that look a bit like this one with random light painting tools being used. So it creates this kind of weird smoky ethereal effect. Quite creepy almost, isn't it? Quite slime-like, or kind of reminds me a little bit of kind of smoky effect. You know, when you've got a moving sea during a long exposure and the sea becomes kind of milky and smoky, it creates a similar kind of aesthetic, effect to that.
So it's almost like a glow-in-the-dark radioactive kind of glow, isn't it?
Kryptonite.
Yes, I'm thinking that.
Yeah. Slimer. I know what you mean. Yeah, it's very kind of, electro kind of luminescent. Right. Finger LEDs, again, cheap and cheerful. You'll get these online without a bother, eBay or Amazon. I came up with this bizarre idea back in, 2007, 2008. I wanted to create these spheres of light. They're known as orbs. Okay, there were just one or two people around the world starting to spin these things back then. A guy called Dennis Smith, a very talented Australian photographer who's become a very good friend of mine. He's the godfather of orbs. He calls his the ball of light. Lovely name. And he uses a kind of wire, a handheld wire device that he's constructed, which is lovely. It's a beautiful device, but I'm useless at using it. Okay, I'll quite happily admit that. And in the early days of light painting, I was so envious of these wonderful orbs that he was making. I wanted to work out my own approach, build my own tool that would allow me a bit more control over how I was spinning the lights around. And this is the tool that I built. Very kind of Blue Peter stuff, all right? It's a 2-meter long aluminium pole from B&Q. Drilled a hole through the middle of it, put a bolt through the middle, a screw, the bolt, to fix it on there. And then I attach a drill to the end of it to spin the pole around. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so once you've kind of tightened the drill onto that, the pole spins when you trigger the drill. And to the ends of that pole, I tape on finger LEDs. Okay, there's my light source. Not a very practical thing to do this because you can't, it's not got a remote where you can switch the lights on and off. You've kind of got to switch each light on individually. It's a bit of a pain, but it works for me. And here I am kind of trying to illustrate in daylight hours how the process works. It's quite tricky to convey this without maybe coming in a workshop or whatever, but you get the gist. You see the little stone that I put in the ground? See the white pebble on the sand? That's my marker. Okay, you need something to aim at on the ground. And the idea is that if you imagine this pole to be spinning in each of these photographs, it's continually spinning. I'm aiming the pole over that central point on the ground, keeping the pole as straight as I can, and walking around in a full 360 around that central point. And by doing so, that's how you create an orb, okay? If you do it very carefully, they look more and more accurate. Takes a little bit of practice, as everything does. You have to get a bit of a feel for this process. It's quite a weird one. But the pole device, this approach to spinning orbs works incredibly well. The people that normally come in my workshops have never spun an orb before, and I talk them through how to use the drill approach. And normally after one or two goes, they're almost bang on. You know, there's so many errors that you can create using other approaches. This kind of omits them. So it's one to remember if you want to try and create some orbs.
A light on a bit of string, just swinging it around, and like you say, errors. Exactly. So many errors.
Yeah. Well, what you just described, that's the kind of basic version of Dennis's tool, Dennis Smith. You know, he's created this kind of rounded plastic head that's got LEDs sticking out the base of it, and it's attached to a wire, and on the other end of the wire is a trigger, okay, where you can put the lights on and off. Okay. And he's a real natural at that. That's why he builds them and sells them. He's very well known for it. But I think because I've been using that drill approach with the pole for so many years, when I eventually came to trying his tool out, my brain just wouldn't let me get on with it. It's not because not that his tool's not good. It's brilliant. Many people love it, but I'm so attuned to that approach now, and I think it's not cheating. I think Dennis used to think it was. It's kind of mechanical. Yeah, we've had a good laugh about that over the years.
Approach,
it's a different approach, and it's problem solving. Okay, that's all I was doing there. Getting more control over the process. I'm a big fan of that. So I'm quite a logical thinker. So it certainly helped with that. Right, here's our lightsaber toy from earlier. And here is a very basic light painting. This is a 30-second long exposure. And I'm quite simply walking towards, I think a lot of people assume I'm walking away from the camera. I'm walking towards the camera, just literally very gently gliding the tool up and down in wave-like fashion. And then it disappeared. I disappeared, so put it into that little hatch in the ground, came back and stood behind my camera after I'd done that. and fired, this is unusual for me, I fired a flash gun into the space, this little alcove that I was working in on half power to illuminate the brickwork. Okay, I could have done it with a torch. I tried, but it was quite dappled and messy. So I used a flash gun to make it more uniform. Bit of trial and error, and after a few goes, I got this image, which I was quite happy with. Very dynamic looking ribbon. A lot of people like this image, I think, because of the flow and the feel of the rainbow, you know. Laser pointers. Okay, I don't suggest you point these up into the night sky and blind any pilots. They do come with safety warnings, don't they, these tools? But you can light paint with laser pointers, as I have tried to do so in the past. Here's one kind of experimental image, and it's an interesting one, this, because coming back to this notion of happy mistakes being made along the way. I was stood behind my camera at distance. This wasn't my wide lens. This was a zoom lens, I remember. It was a very choppy, stormy sea that night, and I was in the car park just with my camera aimed at the rocks being, you know, consumed by the sea. And I stood in the car park and just quite literally, as carefully as I could from distance, colored the rocks in with my laser pointer, you know, from where I was standing. And I couldn't see this with the naked eye, but what was happening during the long exposure is the light was refracting upwards into the sky, as you can see in this image. Quite a bizarre and surreal effect. Again, coming back to kryptonite, Andy. That's what that reminds me of. Superman's worst nightmare.
Yeah, I was wondering what was making that. I really like that, actually.
Yeah, it's the wet rocks, and the light was bouncing upwards. Very strange. Did not know that was happening until the exposure ended, and I was like, what the hell? Anyway, very cool. Torch filters. Okay, two things. You can buy these on eBay or Amazon for relatively cheap. eBay, I think, is the main one I grabbed these off of many years ago. They just little caps that go on the end of specific torches. They fit onto the end, and you can create different colored light, okay, with your torch, and you can use the different, you know, torch light to color things in with. A bit like I've done here. Now, if you want to do it on the cheap, a more creative approach would be, and a more enjoyable approach would be, to get yourself a box of quality street sweeties, eat them all, keep the wrappers, and use the little colored gels. Use them as little colored gels to, with an elastic band, you know, fixed to the end of your torch head. That'll give you something quick and easy to interchange the colors with as well. Right, and you get to eat loads of chocolate and claim it's all in the name of photography and art. Right, steel wool. Nasty stuff, this. Steel wool, wire wool. A lot of people in the early days of experimenting with light painting are drawn to using this. Only do that if you feel comfortable and confident using it, because it burns very hot, and if it lands on you, you will know all about it. I've also heard of some horror stories of people in the US, 2 people in the US, going into listed buildings at nighttime, spinning this stuff around, and just takes a spark to go into the rafters where there's some dry leaves, and the whole place went up like a tinder box. I've heard of that happening twice. So don't be stupid if you're going to use this. Use it outdoors and somewhere that's damp. I would certainly suggest that. I don't like using it full stop. I've only done it a few times, but it does create quite dramatic effects. And the idea is that you tear strips of it off, you stuff it inside a whisk or something that, you know, allows it to be aerated, and you attach a string or a dog lead or something like that to the end of the whisk, and you set the wire, the steel wool, whatever you want to call it, on fire. You ignite it, and you start spinning it during the long exposure, and it creates effects a little bit like this. Okay, it kind of goes flying off up into the sky, and you become like a human Catherine wheel, you know. Yeah, wear a hat and maybe safety goggles. I used to end my outdoor workshops in Guernsey as the guinea pig, and I would say, right, everybody line your cameras up, you know, all in a row, and I'll tell you when to start your exposures, and I would walk into the scene and light my steel wool on fire and start spinning it. It was a nice kind of crescendo for the workshops, but I did it a few times and thought, I've been quite lucky so far, I'm going to quit while I'm ahead. Right, sparklers. We talked about these briefly earlier.
Sorry,
Cheap and
David.
cheerful.
Sorry,
Yeah.
just before we move on, there's a particular type of grade of steel wool, isn't there? Because I think we tried to use a different grade and we just could not get it to light. There's different versions of it.
You're right. So there's like finer and thicker variants of it. So I think, oh man, it's been years, Andy, since I played around with it, but I think it's like 00 or something like that. Okay, yeah. Like 00 gauge steel wool, because it's very thin and it burns easier, burns quicker. That's maybe what you want to look into if you want to get into it. I mean, there's loads of tutorials and stuff, information online if you want to try it, but like I say, just be careful. Just be careful. But yeah, good
Thanks.
point to raise. I think that book maybe covers it as well and tells you the gauge that I've used in the past. Anyway, yeah,
Okay.
that is true.
Yes.
Sparklers, you know what these are. I don't need to rattle on about these for long. Here's a very low resolution shot from years ago. One of my early light paintings. Somebody in Guernsey wanted to commission me to create light paintings around their sculptures in their garden. So creating light sculptures with the sculptures, quite an interesting project. And I used sparklers for a couple of them and drew around the sculptures.
Looks very smooth for sparklers. Certainly on the left side, at least, you can see the sparks on the right, but the left is more.
Yeah, it's because when I was going around the left hand side edge, I was probably just on or just behind the edge of the sculpture, and because the wind was blowing right to left as we look at the image, it's created that kind of gentle smoke effect moving to the left, and
Cool.
That's why it feels a lot softer there, and the right hand side feels a bit edgier. Yeah, that's why.
Thank you.
A bike wheel with an axle top through the middle of it, so that the bike wheel is held at a 45-degree angle. That's important, remember that. And then what's also important is to go and get some black insulation tape, find some old Christmas tree lights and tape them onto the outer rim of the bike wheel. I mean, why wouldn't you do this? Everyone's done this, haven't they? No, of course they haven't. So this was a guy called Andy White, down in England somewhere, and he built this kind of prototype and took it out with him one night and gave it a gentle nudge so that it spun around that central point on the ground. And lo and behold, he created these beautiful things called domes. And the great thing about this process is once you've built the tool, which isn't very difficult, gravity does all of the work for you. You just have to give it a bit of a kick or a nudge to get it spinning. So there's a nice, easy way to go light painting and create something visually quite stunning, really. They're lovely, very symmetrical. These go down quite well in workshops. People, lots of oohs and ahs. Right, physiograms. Here's another relatively easy way to go light painting. In the winter months, when it's too cold outside and wet and you don't want to go outside, you can hang a light from your ceiling, okay, using blue tack firmly attached, or a cup hook, I would recommend using. A weighted LED hanging from the ceiling, and you're going to have the camera directed upwards towards the ceiling for this, okay? So unlike outdoor photography where it's directed straight ahead, it's aimed up at the ceiling. And the idea is that you, in the dark, you spin the light from the ceiling, so it's spinning around in a circular motion, and the long exposure captures that. And if you add more than one spin to the same exposure, kind of layering it in a single long exposure, essentially, you can create rather wonderful effects. And that's some L wire. You see that textured backdrop that's kind of in the image? That's me jiggling some L wire around in the background initially just to create, a slightly different background. I made hundreds of these. I don't know what year it was, 2010, 2011, something like that. I had a friend of mine that was starting to make physiograms. It became a bit competitive, and we used to go into our garages at night time and see who could come up with the craziest ideas. Very experimental and fun. The pixel stick, I know it's 8:30. We'll try and wrap this up in the next few minutes. This is the pixel stick. It's a dreadful image, isn't it? I've just nicked this off their website. It's a 2-meter long pole, essentially, okay, programmable light wand. It takes an SD card, and this tool, I could speak to you all for 2 hours tonight and just teach you about this tool on its own. It reads image files and paints them in light. Okay, that's what it does. It's quite remarkable. It's, like I say, it's a pretty long tool. It's quite unwieldy in that sense, not that very practical to kind of swing it around. You wouldn't want to really. But it reads image files, and you can upload images into it and then light paint them into landscapes and scenes to create very surreal looking images indeed, like this one.
That's awesome.
Yes, it's quite an extraordinary tool. It does something that none of the other tools do. This is good to have in the kit bag. And here's a prettier one, T-Rexes and butterflies. That's a nice, T-Rexes and butterflies. It's a good name for an album or something, isn't it? That's mine. Right, glow sticks, Amazon, eBay. You can pick these up really easily online. You all know what they are, glow sticks. What I do like to do during my workshops, because it's very funny, it's a great spectator sport, this one, is I get the attendees to line up and we color ourselves in using the glow sticks during the long exposure, okay? Yeah, should I tell this? Yeah, I'll tell this story, why not? This is a bizarre one. I was flown out to Luxembourg to teach a series of light painting workshops at a school there. quite strange how that all unfolded, but they wanted me to go out there and teach. And I went out there, and one of the young boys who I was teaching in the group decided to over embellish one of his bodily features using the glow stick. So when the final image popped up on the back of the camera screen, his teacher was not impressed. So you can kind of, if you imagine when you're coloring your body and as a template, it's kind of like self-Photoshop. You can give yourself 4 arms if you want, you know. He did something else. It was hilarious. Right, this is called a universal connector. It's a rubber tube, essentially, a rubber connector that fits onto the end of many torches. And the guy called Jason Page in America came up with this concept, and you attach it to the end of a torch, and then you insert into it different light painting tools that fit into the top end of it, okay? So the torch becomes the light source, and you just attach different heads, different light painting tools into the upper section, so you can create a range of different light painting. This is what I mean by light painters creating light painting tools. This has been happening now for a few years, and some really cool stuff's starting to happen. And this is the latest tool that's just come out called the RGB Critter. I now have 2 of these. I helped fund this online when the concept was kind of floated and launched. Some guy in the US wanted money to kind of get it off the ground, and me and many other light painters gave him some money and bought one of the early versions of this. I've got a couple. They're so popular in the workshops, I needed a second one, because this torch is incredible. It does all sorts of weird color changing things, and you attach different devices to the ends of it and so on. Right. Whew. 1 hour and 5 minutes. I almost did that in an hour, didn't I? The second half will be similar. Fast and furious, lots of images. I'll stop sharing for now. Andy, any questions before we take a breather?
I'm good just now. Nick, how about yourself? Nope. Okay. That's fine. Right, guys. 5 minutes then. I'll pause the recording. 5 minutes, and we'll grab drink water, whatever, and we'll see you back here very, very shortly.
See you soon.
Thank you. See you soon. Bye.
Yeah.
Okay, and we're back. So, David, carry on, please.
Okay, welcome back. Right. So we've been through a tutorial. We've been through light painting tools and some of the effects that they can create. Now we're going to work our way through a small portion of my kind of portfolio, if you like, of light paintings that I've made from over the years. I've kind of picked out some interesting ones and some images that are useful to talk through, if you like, during presentations to explain how they were made. I'll describe what tool I used in each instance and kind of talk through how I moved, how I controlled the light to create the desired effect, and so on. So here we have the first one. Back in Guernsey, I told you the bathing pools were my usual testing ground, didn't I? Here we have that kind of lightsaber tool, you know, the one we've seen a couple of times now. And what I did for this particular image, the concept I had in mind before I started this photo shoot was I wanted to quite simply coat the ground in light. Okay, so I stood at the far end, the back of the shot, whilst the exposure was running, and walked towards the camera. Okay, kind of hunched over, moving the lightsaber, if you like, from left to right and back again. Repeated that process all the way up towards the legs of my tripod, to ensure that, you know, from front to back, I'd kind of coated, as I say, coated the ground in light. And that's the resulting image we're looking at right now. So again, prior to doing that, I would have run a test shot to make sure I was relatively happy with the exposure of the landscape and so on. You can see there's some moonlight kind of reflecting on the water on the right-hand side there. There was some moon shining down. And the sky in this image looks kind of dark, and it's because it was so bright, this image, because I think it was a full moon. I did something I very, very rarely do, and that is I just darkened the sky very slightly using a filter in Lightroom, because it was pretty punchy, and I quite liked, well, the effect that, you know, was achieved by just darkening it I think it was 1 stop or something like that. But that's how this image was put together. Again, same tool. Very, very, very early light painting of mine, just getting to grips with how to move with the tool to create smooth ribbon shapes. And as I always like to do, anyone that's seen my, a lot of my light painting work will pick up on the fact that I love working on beaches, and I love working near, close to, or next to, damp sand or water. I think the reflective qualities of water can be quite amazing when kind of combined with light painting. That marriage between light painting and reflection is very special. And so this is just me getting very wet feet, walking from left to right and right to left again, and waving the lightsaber around again. And this image, and this is always a funny one to show, this was created by my wife, right? So she sometimes comes out light painting with me. Every so often she'll show a bit of an interest and come out. Not, I think we've been out light painting together a handful of times, but this was the first ever time she came out with me in Guernsey. And my mum was there as well. She was really curious because I was doing quite a lot of this by then, and they were wondering what I was getting up to at, between midnight and 3 a.m. And so they came along, and I handed my wife, this saber kind of tool, and said, right, give it your best shot. Just walk through the scene and move it around. And she did that. And me and my mum, I remember, were stood behind the tripod, literally laughing out loud at her, going, what on earth is she doing? Because we could just see in the dark this kind of movement, and it looked silly. And we just thought, she clearly doesn't have a clue what she's doing. And then after, 3 or 4 minutes, this image popped up in the back of the camera, and we just stood there in amazement and went, blooming heck, that's gorgeous. This is what happens with light painting sometimes. It does not look like with a naked eye what it does, what the camera's picking up. And I uploaded this image to Flickr along with all my other light painting work as I was doing at the time. And I was gaining a bit of a following back then because I was one of a few people around the world who are really trying to kind of push the boundaries of light painting. And I was getting lots of likes and comments, the usual stuff that doesn't mean a great deal. And my wife's image, we uploaded that. And within a day or two, we got an inquiry from someone in Australia saying they absolutely loved it. Could they use it as their next album cover for this music album they were releasing? So this ended up on someone's album cover in Australia. And it was her one and only light painting at the time. So I was truly deflated. No, I wasn't deflated. I was very happy for her. It was such a funny story. And that this lovely lady in Australia, it wasn't even a paid job as such. I think she gave us a token fee and sent us a few copies of our album with this on the cover, which was lovely. I've got it just down there somewhere. Quite a funny story because it was the one light painting she made. And lo and behold, I should take her light painting more often, shouldn't I? Right, maybe I shouldn't actually. Quite a threat. So here we are. I was driving around the island and saw these buoys that had been taken out of the sea to be restored, probably chiseling off all the barnacles, from the underside, and thought, right, they're out the sea. I'm going to use them. I'll create the sea. I created these kind of waves of light using the same tool again. And the beauty of that tool, which again, I'm sorry to say, is very difficult to find, but the beauty of that tool is you can freeze it on certain colors. Okay, so it cycles through 7 different colors, but you can tell it to stop on blue, green, pink. You get the idea. So I froze up in blue and just kind of walked backwards and forwards many, many times to kind of coat the ground in light to give this, to insinuate waves, reclaiming the buoys. A very simple shot. So damp sand, 2 passes in front of the camera, one very close to the base of the camera, where the tripod was, and one slightly further back, moving it nice and smoothly with my arm, creating these kind of wiggly ribbons with the remnants of the sunset in the background. Very straightforward stuff.
David, are you trying to time the tides on this one as well? Are you waiting for the tide sort of just gone out so it's still fairly damp and you've got a good bit of distance in it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'm not allowed to speak about this. It's absolutely ridiculous. Not that. I'll answer that question. But I went back to Guernsey this summer, okay, which was meant to be a chilled out 2 weeks, catching up with family and seeing a lot of old friends. But for the last 6 weeks now, I've been working on a massive, it's the biggest job I've ever taken on. It's a huge global advertising campaign that involves light painting. I can say that, that's safe enough. I'm not allowed to mention the client because I've had to sign disclaimers and stuff. But long story short, they wanted me to go out to the, Saudi Arabia and make some of this work for them. And I was like, I can't. My summer was very busy. And I said, but what I can do is I can go to Guernsey and make the light painting element of the work that you need. So that's what I did. And yes, exactly the same approach as we're looking at right now. So I'm so used to light painting in Guernsey because this was my old playground, like I said, right? I was there for many years, 14 years. And I went out a lot to this particular beach, Vazon, to light paint. And yes, I would often wait or try to coincide the nighttime shoots where the tide was retreating, okay, leaving behind damp, virgin sand, nice clean sand, right? Not only for reflections, but because there's no footprints or dog's paw prints running through it, kind of thing. That's my preferred approach, and that's what we're looking at here. Really, you can see the odd footprint from me walking through the shot, but damp sand's quite good in that respect as well, because your footprints normally kind of submerge into the damp sand and then vanish. So it looks like you were never there. And I love this idea of the photographer remaining invisible, but only leaving behind a trace of light where they once were. I find it very poetic. And that's what I tend to try and achieve in most of my light painting works. Good question. And that's what I did this year. So that job I've been working on, that I spent many nights in Guernsey, Mel, remember Mel? She, my wife, she came with me on a few of those nights this year in Guernsey, and I had to drag her out between midnight and 4 a.m. to make the work.
Sure, she appreciated that.
Like, it was nice. It was nice to an extent because it was kind of old school, harking back to what we used to do. But it was hard work. It really was. But that's why we were going out at those times. We could have gone out at 9 p.m, but we had to wait till the tide was going down. You see, so
okay,
yeah, bit of moonlight, tide, weather. Once all these things kind of marry together, to create the perfect environment for light painting, it's a truly wondrous night normally. Right, here we are in Scotland. Here are the standing stones of Callanish up in the Isle of Lewis. And I'm running around with a kind of custom-made lightsaber this time, using strip LEDs. That's why there's gaps in between them all the lines. That's strip LEDs you can buy from B&Q, the various lighting shops, just kind of taped together on a battery device. And it comes with a little remote. You can change the color, freeze the color, that kind of thing. Very easy to kind of cobble that kind of thing together. So yeah, bit of DIY. You can make your own light painting tools relatively easily as well. That was a brutal trip, that, up to Lewis. I think there's some orbs later on, an orb that I'll show you from Lewis. But it was, we got bombarded with hailstones for about an hour before they cleared off. And then there was about 10 minutes of peace and quiet, the image you're looking at right now. I did a couple of ribbons, a couple of orbs, and then we got absolutely battered by hailstones again and had to leave. And we'd spent 2 days getting up there. I was so excited about light painting on Lewis, and I think I got that one night out, and it was almost totally disastrous. Anyway, again, this is a ridiculous story behind this one. Same tool again, custom made kind of LED one. Isle of Arran, the Macri Moor stones, standing stones, out on Macri Moor, funnily enough. We got absolutely, oh no, poor Mel. It's always when Mel's with me, these things happen. So she's not been out with me that often, but we spent 20 minutes, half an hour walking out into the middle of this moor a few summers ago. And I remember saying to her, now we just need to be wary, there might be midges about, and we had midgie nets and repellent and all that stuff. And Mel forgot the midgie nets in the car, and off we plodded through the fields into the middle of nowhere. And it was perfect for a while until the sun set, and it was like a light switch. It's like millions upon millions of midges descended upon us, and I could barely even shout or speak instruction over to Mel to start and stop the exposures, because every time I opened my mouth up, I inhaled midges. They were in my eyes and my ears. It was gross. Yes, Nick, it was gross. You got to suffer for your art, right? So yeah. I made, again, 3 or 4 light paintings before we admitted defeat very quickly and ran like the wind back to the car, distraught and traumatized. Oh dear, right. Guernsey again. That's the pixel stick. You can put it into what's called like a color mode. I'm just kind of moving this 2-meter long pole up and down as best I can physically in front of some wet sand again to create this kind of punchy effect. Bit of an experimental shot, not a great light painting, but you get the gist. Very nice colors. I was just trying to get to know the tool at the time and see what it was capable of. And ribbons, these have become quite popular and kind of one of my signature styles, ribbons of light, traveling through various landscapes on a journey through the image. I do like them. And if you're lucky enough to be able to get this kind of glow or reflection off your light painting tools, I mean, I'm just going to say it feels like they're really there. Of course, they're really there. But the beauty of light painting is these things are sculptural. They are sculptures. They're light sculptures. They're just not tangible. Okay, they exist, but they're just not tangible. There's something really quite beautiful about that. And like I say, they leave behind a path where the photographer once was. You must try this if you've not done much of it. Here we have a light spinning from my ceiling again in my garage. I had a keychain that was of a little butterfly that when you pressed the button, it flashed. All right. So all I did was hold that butterfly above the camera lens after I'd spun the physiogram thing, and the butterfly froze into the shot as well. Okay. Anything works. Anything that illuminates in the dark and is portable can be a light painting tool. That wasn't meant to be, but was used as one. I did all sorts of weird experiments with physiograms using acetate, and the reason you can see different things going on in a lot of these shots in the background and the foreground is because I would normally put the camera lens on top of the camera during the exposure, change the light that was hanging, change the color, spin it again, and just kind of repeat that process a few times during the single long exposure, creating this kind of layered effect of different things going on in the same shot. This is maybe my second. Remember that first light painting I showed you with the spirals around the wooden structures? This is maybe my second one. I immediately had this idea in my mind that I wanted to create footsteps of light walking through the image, traveling through the image. And so I cut out templates of my shoes, as you do, using black card, and then used my little pen torch and drew around the shape of my feet on the ground, and then just moved the card again and again and again, and repeated that process, guessing roughly how they should be spaced to make it feel like they were moving through the image as if I was walking. Full moon again, as you can see, very, very bright evening. Orbs and ribbons in the same shot. You can, of course, mix things up and add different, structures and sculptures and light paintings to the same shot. It can be really nice to do that. Very misty evening. You can see the mist in the background. And you see the break in the stars. Can you see those few little stars that are in the sky there that kind of got a line through the middle of them? Can you guess, Andy or Nick, why that might be?
I feel like you should have a guess of some sort.
You don't need to if you can't be bothered.
But is it like the ISS or something?
It's not something moving through them. It's apparent in every star that's in this image if you look closely enough. But it's because when I spin my orbs, do you remember I said earlier, I have to kind of one by one switch all the lights on, individually. Yeah. So it's really impractical in some ways. So when I spin more than one orb in a shot, I need someone to cover my lens for me while I run out the shot. Otherwise, the light trails out the image, right? So I've got Mel or somebody stood behind. It's terrible. It's becoming comedic that Mel is involved in it. It's not. She's very helpful. So someone's standing there and putting the card over the lens, and I'm saying, right, tell me when it's covered. And they say covered, and I run out the shot and then maybe change orb poles to a different color, and then wander back in, spin another orb, and then leg it again. So that's why when the camera's covered, you'll see these little breaks in the stars momentarily. Single long exposure, but just broken up. A bit like putting the lens cap back on again. Loch Lomond, here we are back at kind of along from Balmahat, Millerrocky Bay. We've got the lovely tree. Our raft had washed up to the side of the loch, and I was teaching two people who had driven down from Aberdeen. They were so keen on being taught by me, they wanted to make the journey down from Aberdeen in the middle of the night to go on a light painting workshop, a kind of private light painting workshop. So we met up here, and I said when we arrived there, I was like, hello, there's a raft. We have to use that. So I braved it and got my welly boots on and spun an orb on top of the raft. It worked beautifully. We had a really fun night, and the conditions were perfect. It was calm, it was warm. It was just a lovely evening, and we made some beautiful light. They were really lucky. We made some really special light painting work that night. Conditions were just great. The moonlight was just kind of diffused behind the clouds, as you can see. It was just, it was lovely. And you see the kind of red light on the tree as well. We kind of used a torch with a coloured filter on top of it, just to project a little bit of side lighting onto the tree as well. It all just came together really nicely that night. Double orbs. Here's my little butterfly keychain again. And double orbs. I've got two different lengths of pole that I usually spin my orbs with. So you can spin the small one first, and then in the same exposure, spin the larger one secondary to that in the same place. And it looks like it's encapsulating the smaller one. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it looks like they're kind of, you can spin them at the same time by putting, lights further up the pole. Doesn't look as good though. I normally just spin one orb smaller and then go back and spin a second one over the top. It creates that kind of encapsulated feel, which is quite wonderful, quite interesting anyway. And again, talking about full moons, the moon can have a profound effect on your light painting shoot for obvious reasons, really. But it can make, the nightscape feel like daytime if you let the exposure run long enough sometimes. It's fascinating how the landscape can appear and feel on the brighter evenings.
Do you ever use an ND filter of some sort to darken down if you need the time?
Yeah, I've been asked that a few times, and the answer is not really, although I can think of one, maybe two, but certainly one occasion where I used a graduated filter to help darken the sky slightly, which sounds ridiculous, doesn't it, at nighttime, but it's because it was so bright. The the sky was so bright in comparison to the foreground.
Yeah.
I needed to just nullify that slightly. So I used the graduated filter to kill the sky a little bit. It's a good question, but it's not something I regularly think about or need to do.
No, because it would obviously darken the light of the actual light that you're trying to use as well.
Exactly. If your light painting enters that part of the frame, then it will impact that as well. So yeah, you'd have to consider that for sure. Right, here we are in Rosslyn Chapel. I was invited along there just pre-COVID. It was a shame. It was such a great workshop. It was a literacy festival or something. Festival about books, all right. They asked me along to teach the members of this festival about light painting. They were fascinated by it, and they got me into Rosslyn Chapel. This is where Dan Brown's novel was partly based on. Apparently, the Da Vinci Code. Apparently, the Holy Grail is perhaps embedded underneath this floor. There's something to think about when you're teaching a workshop. It was quite an amazing tour they gave me. Really wonderful, kind of surreal evening. And we spun orbs and did ribbons through the church. It was really lovely. Quite a tricky space to work in some respects, because it was pitch black. So we had to use, as you can see, the candles just to help give some kind of sense of form and space to the area. And it created this lovely warm kind of glow, which kind of in stark contrast to the kind of cooler colours of the orbs and so on. It was an interesting evening, that one. Yeah, he told you there was another one. Here we are back at the standing stones of Callanish, dodging hailstones. You can just make out my silhouette. See, if you look at the base of this orb, you'll see two kind of subtle dark lines coming out the bottom of the orb. That's my feet. That's my dark trousers and shoes. This happens sometimes, especially if the ground is wet, okay? Because the light's bouncing off the ground as you spin an orb, okay? Because the lights are going up and down. And the ground was very wet because it had just been raining, like I say. So it was very reflective, and my dark trousers were silhouetting against the light patch of grass that I was working on. That's why you're seeing that happening there. If you're working in a very dark space with dark ground, concrete, stones, that won't happen so much, but it can happen if you're wearing dark clothes, which you should do when you're outdoors at night time to blend into the environment. In fact, we didn't touch upon that earlier, did we? I should really emphasize that. So 3 key kind of rules of light painting are wearing dark clothing, okay, because you want to blend into the night. 2 is movement. You want to continually be moving or on the move so that you don't form within the exposure unless you want to. And 3 is try not to illuminate yourself with your light painting device, okay? As I was just describing there, it was kind of unavoidable for me on this occasion. Here we are back in Loch Lomond again with the raft, which was there for 1 day only. It vanished after that night, sadly. I went back to try and reuse it. It was so special, and it was gone. Bit of luck that it was there that particular night, though. You can see the light pollution of Glasgow in the background there, kicking up into the night sky. That was, like I say, that was a really good evening. And if you just kind of look, we can't do it in a slideshow, but if you do look carefully at the reflective qualities of the light painting in the water, it looks like an oil painting. You can get some beautiful additional qualities within the image when you light paint next to water. Something definitely to try out. Light painting indoors. I don't do much of this unless I'm being commissioned and I need to work in a blackout studio or something like I'm doing right now. But I sometimes, if I'm interested, work within places that are of interest. And in Guernsey, there was a tower block that was 8 stories high. They were going to rip down and demolish. They didn't in the end. They ended up, giving it a bit of a facelift, but they were very close to tearing it down. And I asked special permission to go in there to create a series of light paintings that I eventually exhibited in the town centre. I wanted to light paint on all the different levels, where people had inhabited these kind of familiar spaces that were now empty. And I went in there and spent a couple of weeks light painting. It was terrifying. I was going in there at like 10 p.m. and working till 1 or 2 a.m. with a friend, not Mel, working late into the night. And it was empty. So some of the windows were smashed and the doors would rattle and some of the doors would slam with the wind coming through the windows. It was horrible. It was really creepy. And I remember saying to my mate Ross, pretty much every night we walked in there, did you hear that? What the hell was that? And he was like, stop doing that. You're freaking me out. And then one night I said what I'd said every night to him. I was like, did you hear? There's someone on the stairs. He just kept going, shut up, David. But that night I was right. The door flew open. We're up on the 6th floor. And a couple of police officers came in with a very angry Alsatian and had me up against the wall. The States of Guernsey had given me permission to work there. The police didn't know I was in there. And I think a worried neighbour had seen lights flashing in the windows and thought, something very strange was going on, which it was. and they came rushing in, and it took some explaining. I don't know who was more surprised, me, because they kind of rumbled me and kind of burst in on me and gave me a right old fright, or them, because they probably thought they were going to burst in and catch someone, graffitiing on the walls. Instead, they burst through the door and saw someone running around the hall with a lightsaber. So they were very confused. Anyway, they came to my exhibition, which was a nice touch. We had a good laugh about it in the end. Good story, that one, at my expense. Here's a smaller orb. This was the basement of the building, terrifying place, like I say. And you can see the window bits falling off it. And in the basement, unbeknownst to us, when we went down there in the pitch black, there was a bunch of prams lined up against the wall with toy babies in them. And to happen upon them in the dark was not much fun. So I had to include that in one of the
That's
images.
just a whole lot creepy, isn't it?
Just that place was so freaky. I can't really describe in words just how scary it was. I was very relieved when I finished making that work. I did not enjoy making this series of images at all.
I think it adds to the creepiness that there's like the end pram doesn't have a baby in it.
Yes. Where's that one gone? There's two missing. Oh dear. That was really scary place. I think this might be the final image, maybe the second last image from in here. This was up on the top floor where the attic was, going up to the attic. Man, it was weird. Yeah. Good exhibition though. Right. Here we are back on Aaron, me being eaten alive by midges for your viewing pleasure. Back on Guernsey now, spinning an orb on top of a kind of plinth, a kind of platform, maybe left behind by the Germans. The Channel Islands were occupied, of course, in World War II. So there are many structures around the coastal areas that the Germans put up, big concrete structures and bunkers and stuff. Fascinating place for photography. They make for interesting subject matters, sadly. They kind of punctuate the landscape. This was a weird evening. I ended up going out to spin orbs for a project, and I couldn't work out what was wrong with my white balance, because I normally always shoot in auto white balance, and everything was red, right? I came home and every image I uploaded into Lightroom was red. But when I corrected the red, all the light painting colors were wrong. So I was like, what the hell is going on? And I only found out the next morning that there'd been such a massive aurora display. It came as far south as the Channel Islands, and someone in Jersey had captured all the purple streaks of the aurora. And it was my long exposure photography, which were minutes long. You're not going to see the aurora essentially in that, the streets, but you're going to see a merging of the colors. And that red that you can see in the background was remnants of that. Very weird night. I was gutted when I found that out. Anyway. Spanksy. Oh, this was the pixel stick. So I became a pretend graffiti artist for a short while on Guernsey and kind of wrote my imaginary name around the island on objects and walls. Instead of Banksy, I was Spanksy. This project didn't really have legs. I did a few of them. No one found it that funny. I did. Here are my Star Wars inspired image. Again, the pixel stick, which can read image files. Such a bonkers tool, this one. It really is. It does some weird and wonderful things. This is the War Memorial in town in St. Peter Port. Slightly more meaningful image, this one. And a bunch of science students, I think it's Glasgow University, who wanted me to light paint their logo, their name behind them. So I asked them to kindly sit very still and walk behind them with a pixel stick as I wrote out their name. Very cool image, that one.
I just need to ask, the pixel stick, is that, like, I can understand what it's doing, but in terms of getting the spacing right and everything, is that based on your timing, or is that a stick realizing how the distances that you're covering and
it doesn't auto calculate the distances because it doesn't have any sensors, but what you have to do is you can go into the menu on it and you can speed up or slow down the reading of the image file. Okay. So it tells you how fast you need to walk from point A to point B, right? So if it was saying 12 seconds, for example, and I was like, bloody hell, it's only going to take me 3 or 4 seconds to walk behind them, I'll slow the percentage down, the speed of it down.
Right, okay.
Till it's about 4 or 5 seconds, and then you give it another go, and you get close, then you do it again until you get it, until you nail it, Quite an easy tool to work with once you get to know it. And here's a bodiless and a disembodied Hulk floating on the beach. Why not? Why not? Surreal. Here's Pac-Man earning his dinner. again, back down at the bathing pools. I think this was the early days of getting the pixel stick, and I decided to create an image file and then go off and trying to work out just how long an image I could create, within my own image. It was a monster, that one. And this was during the Stirling Photography Festival. I was doing a demo, holding a kind of workshop and teaching people about the different tools. And this is me mixing, as you can see, domes and ribbons. But interestingly, I include this image not because it's an amazing light painting. It's quite cool, but you can see me behind each of the domes. If you look carefully, you can see my body. See me sort of kneeling down with my arm and my legs. That's me in the background. 1, 2, 3. And it's because this was the last image of the workshop. We rushed it because we were running out of time. And I should have maybe had the camera a little bit, set up to be darker. So you can see me glowing in the background as I'm sitting there waiting for the wheel to stop spinning. Okay. Right, we've still got 20 minutes to kind of rattle through some more images, which I'm going to do now. Any more questions, Andy? I'm going to have a quick sip of water and take a very brief pause. Fire any more questions at me.
I don't think I've got any just now, but I will talk a little bit just so you can get a break and get a drink of water.
Yeah, thanks.
No, it's really quite fascinating. I mean, I've toyed about with a few little sort of chibi. I think I had some of the finger LEDs and some of the plastic tat that you get at some of the festivals and stuff, little spinny lights and things like that. I've tried a few different things. But I mean, nothing to this kind of level, obviously, just to see how smooth and how creative it can actually be.
Yeah, no, you'll get there if you stick at it. Yeah, but I'm the same, up to just a few years ago, I've got a young daughter. I used to take her to soft play all the time. I'm sure you can relate. We used to go to soft play and she would go in the play area. There was a shop right next to it, right? Because they want to get you to spend as much money as humanly possible. And I used to spend time looking at all the tat while she was playing. And I would just look out for any spinny devices, any kids' toys that lit up and spun around. And I would buy them, take them to my next workshop, have a play with them, see what they did, to work out which were good and which weren't. But yeah, you experiment. Right. Kind of the final folder of images, really. There's a small one I'll show you at the end if I've got time. But this is an interesting, different kind of style of light painting, if you like. Because we're not talking about the landscape anymore, okay? We're stripping things right back to basics. The word photography, I always find this really interesting. The Greek word, photography, literally translates as painting with light, okay? So this approach to photography is photography in its most basic form, really, okay? You're stripping it back to essentials. Painting with light is what photography means, which is quite nice to think about. And this series I'm going to take you through now, this is just me in a blackout studio, okay, pitch black room, moving around some tools called light blades in the dark that I got a couple of years ago and started to learn how to use to create light paintings with no context. There's no backdrop, there's no landscape in which they appear, just darkness and light. And I fell in love with this approach to light painting a couple of years ago, and it kind of not renewed my interest, because I'm always interested, but kind of gave me an extra jolt of passion, because it's been so refreshing to learn about something new. So a French-Canadian guy called Patrick Rochon came up with this interesting device. This thing here is the important part. Here's the torch. Here's the fitting that screws into the top of the torch, right? He calls it a Kyo, K-Y-O, for his light blades. And the acrylic shapes fit into that slit in the top of the Kyo, okay? You can see that slit in the top. That's where you kind of post the shapes of acrylic in to be held. And here are the different shapes that you can buy and source online. He's produced a whole range of these things. I've got a whole bunch of them. They're very, very cool indeed. I've spent a small fortune on them. These all come along to the workshops and stuff. The collection of tools I have now is getting worryingly large. Anyway, they're brilliant. And here are a couple of them stuffed into the top of the torch. And I've put a couple of colored gels at the bottom just to inject some color up through the blades. I've also colored in the edges of the blades using Sharpie pens, okay, to add colors to the edges. You can do that using felt tip pens. You can clean that off as well, which is nice. And the idea is that you just quite literally get moving, okay? So thrash around in the dark, try not to hurt yourself using the light blades, because I mean, you look at the shapes of some of them, they look like weapons, don't they? You don't want to get that wrong, but if you're waving it around in front of you, not much can go wrong, really. So all these images I'm going to take you through now, they're very abstract. Okay, this is light painting stripped back to its kind of basic elements, movement and light in the darkness. And the acrylic adds this beautiful quality, to the light. You can see these images look quite different to what I've shown you so far. They almost remind me of, glass makers when they kind of use the molten glass to shape. It reminds me of that kind of bending plastic feel, to the images. And of course, it's because the plastic's being moved around at speed that's being illuminated. And it creates this very unique aesthetic. Here's the starburst I was talking about earlier, Andy, directing a torch during the long exposure in the dark towards the lens to create a rather interesting effect. A bit over the top of that, but you get the idea. Again, these are all just rough experiments. I'm going to make a lot more of this work, I think, later when I've finished a couple of projects. It's very enjoyable to make. And unlike the landscape work that I've been showing you so far, that I plan, there's a relative element of planning involved. So I might want, I'll have in mind a location where I want to place an orb or a ribbon, and I'll kind of work out how I need to move through the space. These images are all kind of the opposite of that. So almost lack of thought, no planning, emptying my mind and just running short and sweet exposures, maybe 5 seconds long, and repeating that process over and over and over again until I create a series of images that I like the look of. Very cathartic.
I like that one. I like that one in particular.
Yeah, I like that one as well. It's do you see what I mean by the kind of molten glass?
Yeah.
It's got that feel, like the bending, kind of twisting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're very three-dimensional at times, and others not. But there's something quite beautiful about the quality of the light. You can really feel the journey that it's on,
Yeah.
This one reminds me a bit of Superman. You start seeing things in these images, in terms of shapes, and it's like cloud spotting. You start seeing things in the images if you go looking for them. And what you can do as well, which I've done with some of the light blades, is you can sand them. Okay, so using sandpaper, you can sand the edges or sand the face of the light blades, so the light has a different quality when it travels through the acrylic. Once you've sanded it, you can't unsand it. You just have to remember that. Okay, so unless you've got a bunch of them, which I do, I kind of pick one or two that I don't mind sanding, and then I'll give them a go. I don't do it to all of them. Change things up a little bit. This is a slightly different tool called a light flute. It's a bit of industrial piping with some holes drilled up the side of it. That attaches onto that torch fitting I was talking about earlier, that kind of rubber torch fitting called the universal connector. Back to light blade work. You can just about see me in this image. Can you see my jeans at the bottom, in the middle, and my face and torso just kind of in the middle hole?
Just, yeah. Well, because you mentioned
just about. It's difficult, but I am just starting to appear in that image. This does happen now and then. It's quite interesting. I don't know if I like it or if I don't. Sometimes it's quite funny. Sometimes it's annoying because you just want it to be clean, you just see the light. And you're like, damn it, there's my face. Like, for example, this one, I would have been really annoyed if I'd appeared in this one because I really like the organic nature of the shape and the movement. And it's difficult to repeat the exact movements you've done, the time before. So it's nice. It's nice when you kind of feel like you've nailed a shot with the light blades. But it's very graffiti-esque as well when you think about it. Some light painting can be known also as light graffiti, and you can see why. It feels like it's a tag or a signature almost sometimes.
Yeah,
which is quite interesting.
See on this, sorry, just go back, or even that one actually, where you've also got the torches producing starburst, which is fine. But just to probably the middle left a little bit, there's almost a gold one coming through. Is that purely just a reflection, or was that a torch as well?
Yeah, the gold one would have been the actual light blade itself.
Just the way it's
that one.
bounced.
Yeah. So the base of the torch has got little slits, and if it's directed exactly straight on the camera lens, it will burst out. And I think I had a yellow gel at the bottom of that one. So It's just created a mini starburst itself.
Yeah, I've noticed a few. I think the next one's got a couple as well. Just a few, just sort of dotted around, and sometimes it just got that nice little flash. If you
and
like.
that's only from the light blade in this one.
Yeah.
That's what. And this is a funny one. Can you see? This reminds me of the side profile of a puffin. Once you've seen it, you kind of can't unsee it. Come on, Nick. You got it? It's called the puffin. Puffin and puffin. But yeah, really addictive form of light painting. This I got really into this. This was just kind of pre-lockdown. Okay, so early 2020, late 2019. I had all these light blades, and I kept going back to the Blackout studio and just booking out a couple of hours, a couple of times a week, and just playing around. Great fun. Color gels, you can get these online or from like filming companies and so on. I'm cutting these up and using the colors inside the tools to inject color through the acrylic. And what I've done here is, as you can see, I've just kind of taped on strips of different colors. And this is a fiber optic tool. Okay, it's a fiber optic head that fits on top of the torch. Dreadful image, this one, but that's just to show you the fiber optics kind of glowing in the dark when it's switched on. Here is the tool. And I'm quite into my F1. My intention was to create a series of images that were all about speed and movement, okay, and different colors that represented different teams. That was the idea. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. But what did end up happening was a series of images that are quite interesting because of these lovely fine lines being produced by the fiber optic tool, which I find quite mesmerizing, quite different to any of the other works. Very abstract, very painterly, funny enough. But you get the idea, just a very different aesthetic. And I love some of these. I'm going to do a lot more of this at some point. And these are very short exposures, working quite close to the camera lens. Okay, 4 or 5 second long exposures kind of thing. Just sweeping the fiber optic brush around in front of the lens with no exact plan, which will suit most.
Got a nice flow to it, though, doesn't it?
Yeah. As long as you've got some nice flicking movement, it should work well. And this is one of the latest tools that I've got called. Remember, I think I showed you the torch earlier, the RGB Critter, the one I helped kind of crowdfund. Yeah. It's I've got a couple of these now and a few new fittings that go on top of it that arrived last week. So I've been in the studio experimenting with new blades and new attachments. And you can strobe the torch and all these different kinds of things. So the last workshop I taught using this tool, well, 2 workshops, one in Guernsey and one in Scotland. It blew everyone away. That's why I bought a second one. Everyone was just like, whoa, when they saw this thing up and running. Yeah. And I think a few people went straight off to buy it. In fact, it's a very cool tool indeed. Anyway, I think that's the last image in that folder. I'm just going to show you a few last images because these were made this summer, which is the only reason they feel a bit more relevant to kind of end on. So I was working on this massive commission, which I'm not going to show you. I'm not allowed to, but it'll be launched, online soon and around the world. And when it is, I'll put it on social media. So keep an eye out on my website and stuff. But I made a few light paintings for myself as well this summer when I was on Guernsey. Kind of returned the vase on, that beach I've mentioned a few times, to kind of hang out on and make some light painting for my own portfolio. You can see my silhouette. You see my head in the orb, inside the orb against the sky, that kind of dark patch. That's my head just silhouetting against the fading sunset in the background. It's quite faint, but you can kind of, if I hadn't told you that was my head, you wouldn't probably know. But
I can see even when you have told me that.
yeah, that's my head, kind of ponytail sticking out the back, just kind of starting to appear. Yeah, Guernsey's some great places to light paint there. Like I say, a very safe island to kind of kick about on. And reflections and wet sand, oh my goodness, my favorite thing. That's just the reflections, being cropped in on, which I find fascinating. And for this project, I've been creating a lot of ribbons, okay, traveling ribbons through space. And the company that I've been working with were asking me how high, I could get my light source to go. And I said, well, there are physical limitations. I can only reach so high. And one of my friends does various things, and one of those things is cleaning windows. And he said, I've got one of these extending poles. And this was at one of its lowest settings, believe it or not. So we took this pole out and attached the lightsaber to the end of it. And we're kind of wafting it around. It was so difficult to control, as you can imagine. The longer and heavier the pole was, it just became really impractical to kind of move around smoothly. But we gave it a good go, and we created a few weird light paintings with it. And when you think that orb is 2 meters tall, you get a feel for how high up we were moving, the ribbon tools above it. It's very difficult to move around. And this was me attempting to move that pole around with the lightsaber attached to the end of it. It kind of worked. I was able to move it relatively smoothly, but yeah, it was blooming tricky, I can tell you. Right. That's the end of the images, I think. I'll show you a couple of very last things to end on. There's only a few more, you'll be happy to know, and we're done. Right, so as I told you, I hate doing this bit, but it's for those that want to be educated and are interested in learning about these things, it will be helpful. Book about macro photography and little people, my miniature worlds, on my website, as well as light painting. I go into a huge amount of detail in these books about camera settings, tools, all that kind of stuff, where to source things. And if you want to take a screenshot or just remember it or write it down, there's my website. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and as I mentioned, Andy, earlier, if anyone does want to grab a book, there's a discount code. I only give that out to clubs and societies that I end up presenting to. So if you want to save a few quid and want to get a book, they're downloadable ebooks, so they're very practical. You'll just be able to download it. I did that during COVID, you see, so people could learn all around the world, particularly school teachers who felt quite cut off at times. I wanted to produce these kind of educational tools to help others access my knowledge and help their pupils as well. So anyway, there's my information.
Much appreciated.
That's all right. As I told you, I teach workshops. If you ever fancy coming along, they're very popular. They kind of got, they were put on pause for 2 years there for obvious reasons, which was rather painful for me. That's why I wrote books. It was another outlet for me to kind of help teach people. Yeah. But my workshops get booked up very quickly. So if you ever want to come to a light painting workshop or a macro workshop, which is new this year, they've been very popular. They're on my website under workshops. Obviously, you'll find different dates listed when they're available. But I bring along a lot, as you can probably tell, a lot of light painting tools for people to play with and learn about. Yeah, they're really great fun. And these are images. I like to end my presentations showing images that I've not made. All these images on the screen are created by people that have never light painted before and came along to a workshop. So as you can see, it fast tracks you, if you like, in terms of knowledge and understanding of tools and movement. So yeah, feel free to join me one day if you so desire. Right, I'm going to stop sharing. Any final questions? Fire them at me.
There's only one there, and it's just with the kind of tail end there that you said, and obviously the height limits. Have you considered or linking? I can't even make words today. Have you looking at putting lights onto a drone in terms of height and flying it around and that kind of thing?
I've seen plenty of drone light painting online, and it's awesome. It's not something I have begun to scratch the surface of myself. Okay, I don't have a drone. It's a learning curve that I'll have to go on eventually. I'm sure. I've been too busy. I've just not been able to fit that into everything else. But I'd like to. What we did once in Guernsey, my friend Kevin came up with this insane idea. He wanted to get, that nasty steel wool stuff. Mm. He was very good with stunt kites and taking cameras up on his stunt kite, flying them over landscapes. It was quite impressive actually what he achieved using that. And he said to me one night, do you want to come out light painting and we'll attach some steel wool, set it on fire and send it up with a kite? And I kind of looked at him and I said straight away, well, wouldn't the kite catch fire? And he was like, well, it shouldn't, because it'll be dangling off the bottom and the kite will fly the kite around and bring it back. And I was like, it's your kite. I'll bring my camera and off we go. And I did warn him, and yeah, within seconds of the kite got up, it just went up in flames.
You got a shot though, right?
We've got this really cool shot of this fire trail going up into the night sky,
Yeah.
and then just tumbling back down again. Brilliant. Anyway, yeah, I have played around with it. I mean, the other way of doing it is, of course, is just angling the camera down slightly so you're not getting too much sky, so you can reach up and still manage to kind of fill the top of the frame. So you can find your way around it. But if you're using a lot of sky, drone stuff is the way to go for sure.
Cool. Right, Nick, I've talked a lot. You jump in.
There's nothing really. Every question I was thinking of, you answered as we went along, so there's nothing to ask. But I do want to say, like, as we were going through the pictures, I kept seeing things and thinking, oh, that's like fantastic. That's got to be my favorite style of picture now. And then you move on to something else. And it's like, no, this is now the favorite style of picture. So yeah, they were just awesome.
Well, you'll have to try all of them then, Nick.
If I get the time, I'm more kind of opportunistic photographer at the minute. But I love the style of light painting, and I'd love to be able to find the time to get in and try some. I think maybe the abstract stuff doesn't take maybe as much planning. So I'll have to go at that soon.
I would, because listen, we all lead busy lives these days, don't we? And it won't be lost on you. You know, part of the reason for me getting into light painting, I think, there's no coincidence in Guernsey. I had a very busy 9-to-5 job in finance. And not only did I have a very strong creative itch that needed scratching, because I'd stopped making much photography work back then. There's something incredible, and I've heard this many times from other people, there's something very therapeutic about light painting. And, you know, going out at nighttime or working in a dark room and kind of depriving yourself, you know, from a sensory perspective, and then moving lights around to create sculptures, something happens to you when you're making this work. And I've known people who have been suffering from chronic depression that have benefited from it. I've taught autistic people light painting, and they've loved it. There's something about this process that's so gentle and magical that just seems to benefit anyone. So if you're too busy, Nick, that's why you should try light painting. Yeah,
I should. I'll squeeze it in there somewhere. Yeah, I think you're right. It's therapeutic because when you take a photo of something that already exists, you are just capturing an image of something that's there. But I think with light painting, you're actually creating something.
Yeah.
I think that's probably what the difference is.
Yeah, and if we think back to, you know, those landscape images I started with, where I was saying these are essentially, almost kind of copies, representations of what I was seeing other photographers produce and still produce on a daily bloody basis from Guernsey. It gets very boring after a while. I used that boredom and frustration of those images to find a new approach to present those landscapes in a completely different manner to the viewer. That's where my interest in light painting was born. So I wanted to show somebody an image of a very well-known landscape that they see all the time from other photographers and go, look at this. And they were like, what am I looking at? They were like, because it's familiar to them, because they're looking at a familiar landscape, but it's presented in a completely different feel to it. So light painting alters how your perception of the space you're looking at as well. And night photography does that as well on its own, you know. It's I won't keep upselling light painting to you. You can tell how much I love it, I'm sure.
Okay, I think we're probably done there. So, David, just leaves for me then to say thank you very, very much. That was awesome. The images are awesome, as I knew they would be, because, like I say, I've been seeing some of your work for a number of years now. I think it was Light Paint in Scotland was the first group. Many years ago now.
Do you know, it's shameful, Andy, I've still not met up with that bunch. They're doing a meetup in September, but I'm away. And I'm going to have to make it October, November. I will meet up with them at some point. But yeah, Jason and that bunch that kind of organised, and Gary that organised the outing. Yeah. I've been saying for 5 years, I'll be there in the next one. Oh my God, it's embarrassing. But yeah, I will make it out one night with them.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time this evening. It has been excellent, very helpful, very informative, and showing the different kinds of things that you can use and the different tools and stuff. And yeah, trying to figure out how to do an orb was always a pain. So thanks again.
That's all right. My pleasure. Lovely to chat to you.
And to yourself. Thanks a lot, guys. Cheers.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.